She was not remembered for seduction, nor for scandal. She did not lose her head. She endured with intellect, composure, and quiet resolve. Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife of Henry VIII, was more than a survivor of a dangerous king. She was a scholar, a regent, a published author, and a reformer who helped shape the religious future of England. This is the story of the woman who walked into the lion's den and walked out crowned in legacy. And before we dive in, if you wish to uncover more untold stories from history's shadowed halls, please consider subscribing to our channel, liking this video, and sharing your reflections in the comments below. Your voice helps us bring the past back to life. In the spring of 1512, in the rolling hills of northern England, a daughter was born into a world dominated by men and ruled by an ambitious young king. Her name was Catherine Parr, a name that, at the time of her birth, carried no prophecy, no hint of crowns or courts or revolution. And yet, this daughter of a provincial noble family would one day wear the crown of England and survive a marriage that had claimed 5 queens before her. Catherine was born at Kendal Castle in Westmoreland, the first child of Sir Thomas Parr and Lady Maud Green. Though the Parrs held land and influence in the north, they were not among the highest echelon of Tudor nobility. Sir Thomas, however, had secured his place at court as a loyal companion to Henry VII and later to Henry VIII during the early years of the new reign. Maud Green, Catherine's mother, served Queen Catherine of Aragon, consort to the king, and the first great pillar of the Tudor dynasty. It was perhaps no accident that the child was named after the Spanish queen, a woman revered for her piety, intelligence, and strength of character. These were the very traits that would come to define young Catherine Parr, though no one could have foreseen the extent to which her fate would one day mirror the Queen's. In 1517, when Catherine was just 5 years old, her father died suddenly of illness. His death left Maud to manage the family estates and raise 3 children, Catherine, William, and Anne, in a society that largely excluded women from financial and political authority. Yet Maud proved formidable. Educated, principled, and connected at court, she ensured her children received not only security, but exceptional intellectual grounding. From a young age, Catherine demonstrated a keen mind and a love of learning. Under the supervision of her mother and private tutors, she studied Latin and French, languages of diplomacy and scholarship, and later added Italian and Greek to her repertoire. Her instruction was steeped in the values of Renaissance humanism, a movement then reshaping European thought. Rather than being trained solely for domesticity, Catherine was being shaped into something rarer, a woman who could think, argue, and write with conviction. This education would prove crucial, for in the Tudor court, intelligence could be a shield, and sometimes a sword. Catherine would later become the first Queen of England to publish books under her own name, and she would enter theological debates with some of the most learned men of her time. But in 1512, none of this was yet known. She was simply a child born into shadows, shadows of kings, queens, and a kingdom on the cusp of profound change. By the age of 20, Catherine Parr had already buried one husband. Her first marriage, to Edward Burgh, had ended in quiet widowhood, leaving her a young woman navigating the dangerous waters of Tudor society alone. But her second marriage would pull her into the heart of one of the greatest uprisings of Henry VIII's reign. In 1534, Catherine married John Neville, 3rd Baron Latimer, a wealthy landowner and widower, 2 decades her senior. She became Lady Latimer, stepmother to 2 children, and mistress of Snape Castle in Yorkshire, a remote stronghold far from the glittering courts of London. Yet the north of England was restless. Henry VIII's break with Rome, his self-declared supremacy over the church, and his sweeping closure of monasteries had enraged the people. Monasteries were more than places of worship. They were hospitals, schools, and centers of charity. Their destruction left thousands destitute and fearful. And in 1536, fury exploded into open rebellion. It became known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, the largest uprising of Henry VIII's reign, a mass movement of peasants, monks, gentry, and dispossessed commoners, all demanding the restoration of the Catholic faith and the reopening of the monasteries. At first, John Neville remained loyal to the crown. As a landowner and courtier, he was expected to maintain peace in his region. But as the rebellion swelled, with tens of thousands of armed men joining its ranks, Neville found himself in an impossible position. Rebel forces, suspicious of Neville's loyalty to the king, surrounded Snape Castle. It was not an act of friendship, but one of intimidation. Catherine, her husband, and their household became prisoners in their own home, trapped, outnumbered, and powerless to resist. Under the threat of violence, Neville was forced to negotiate. He outwardly sympathized with the rebel cause, not because he truly supported it, but because refusal could mean the slaughter of his family and destruction of his estate. It was a desperate attempt to survive a rebellion that had already swept aside lesser men. For weeks, Catherine lived under the constant fear of death. She watched, waited, and prayed, knowing that any wrong move, any whisper of disloyalty, could be fatal. The king was known for his ruthlessness. To side with rebels was treason. Yet to resist the rebels was, in that moment, equally deadly. It was a time of great danger, but also of quiet strength. Those who remembered Catherine during these dark weeks described her as calm, composed, and fiercely protective of those under her care. When the rebellion was eventually crushed by the king's forces, John Neville was summoned to London to account for his actions. Catherine accompanied him, navigating the treacherous aftermath with a careful, deliberate silence. Though they escaped severe punishment, the experience would leave an indelible mark on Catherine's soul. In the years that followed, Catherine turned increasingly toward the new religious ideas sweeping England. She studied the works of Erasmus, Tyndale, and other reformers. Quietly, cautiously, she began to embrace a vision of faith based not on ceremony, but on personal conscience and the written word. She had learned firsthand how fragile worldly power could be, how swiftly fortunes turned, and how easily loyalty could become a death sentence. These lessons of resilience, discretion, and inner conviction would shape her destiny. For Catherine Parr was not merely surviving the storms of her time, she was preparing to weather the greatest storm of all, marriage to the most dangerous man in England. Soon the king would come calling, and this time duty would demand more than mere survival. It would demand everything. In early 1543, Catherine Parr's second husband, John Neville, Lord Latimer, died after a long illness. The two had been married for nearly a decade. His death left Catherine widowed once again, for the second time by the age of 30. Now, without a husband or children of her own, Catherine returned to London. She accepted a place in the household of the Lady Mary, the king's eldest daughter. It was a modest but honorable appointment, and one that brought her into direct contact with the royal court. There, among the polished courtiers and cautious allies of the crown, she gained a reputation for grace, intelligence, and quiet strength. But it was not only the nobility who took notice. The King of England had begun to observe her too. At this time, Catherine had begun a courtship with Sir Thomas Seymour, the younger brother of Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, and uncle to the young Prince Edward. He was bold, well-connected, and ambitious. And for perhaps the first time, Catherine allowed herself to hope for personal happiness, but fate and the will of a king would intervene. Henry VIII, now aged, ailing, and increasingly isolated, had chosen Catherine as his next queen. To many, it was a surprising match. She was not a noble heiress, nor a foreign alliance. But she was educated, dignified, and devout, and she brought peace where there had been chaos. The aging king nearly twice Catherine's age, saw in her not only a wife, but a nurse, a companion, a possible mother to his youngest son, Prince Edward. And when a Tudor king set his eyes upon a woman, refusal was unthinkable. Faced with a terrible choice, Catherine Parr did not follow her heart. She followed her sense of duty. Turning away from Seymour, she accepted Henry's proposal, not as a triumph, but as a sacrifice. On the 12th of July, 1543, in a private ceremony at Hampton Court Palace, Catherine Parr became the sixth wife of Henry VIII. She was 31 years old. He was 52, plagued by illness, paranoia, and the ghosts of 5 failed marriages. But Catherine accepted her role not with naivete nor with ambition, but with calm resolve. She did not enter this marriage for power or prestige. She entered it because she believed it was her duty. Unlike her predecessor, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr did not compete for Henry's affections with beauty or flirtation. She won his respect through reason, tenderness, and devotion. As queen, Catherine did what few others could. She brought peace to a divided royal household. She welcomed back Mary and Elizabeth, both of whom had been pushed to the margins by political fallout. She created a sense of family where there had once been suspicion. To young Elizabeth, Catherine became more than a stepmother. She became a mentor, one of the few women in the princess's life who treated her with intellectual equality and maternal care. In this quiet domestic diplomacy, Catherine laid the foundation for a future beyond Henry's reign, a future in which a woman would one day rule England in her own right. But not all at court welcomed the Queen's quiet influence. She was too learned, too sympathetic to the new ideas spreading across Europe, and in a kingdom still torn between tradition and reform, influence could become accusation. By the mid-1540s, Catherine Parr had established herself as more than a caretaker to an aging king. She was a patron of learning, a unifier of his children, and increasingly a quiet voice of reform. In private, she read the works of Erasmus and Tyndale. She hosted scholars sympathetic to the Protestant cause. She questioned doctrines long accepted without challenge. And most daringly of all, she debated the king himself on matters of theology. To speak of reform in Henry's court was to walk a knife's edge. Though the king had broken from Rome and named himself supreme head of the Church of England, his own beliefs were far from purely Protestant. He remained deeply traditional, especially on matters of the Mass and clerical authority. Catherine's growing embrace of religious reform did not go unnoticed. Among her enemies was Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, a staunch conservative, loyal to the old ways, and bitterly opposed to any queen who dared meddle in sacred doctrine. To men like Gardiner, Catherine's intellect was not admirable, it was dangerous. Her books, her circle, even her piety, all became ammunition for her downfall. In 1546, the plan was set. Gardiner and his allies drew up a warrant for the Queen's arrest on the charge of heresy. If convicted, Catherine Parr would be stripped of her crown, condemned to death, and likely burned at the stake. Her enemies waited for the right moment, a careless word, a public dispute, a sign that the king's favor was waning. That moment came when Catherine pressed Henry too far in a religious discussion, perhaps thinking she still had his ear. But Henry, now suffering from paranoia and pain, snapped. He ordered her arrested. For the first time since becoming queen, Catherine was truly in danger. She was no longer Henry's comfort, she was his challenge, and the penalty for challenging a Tudor king was death. But Catherine Parr did not panic. Instead, she did what she had learned to do in every moment of danger. She thought and she acted. Faced with the threat of arrest, Catherine Parr knew she had one final chance to save her life, and it would not be won through defiance, but through diplomacy. She approached the king's chamber with care, fully aware that his mood could determine her fate. The warrant for her arrest had already been signed. The charges, heresy. The penalty, death. And yet she did not plead. She performed. Kneeling at Henry's side, Catherine spoke with deliberate humility. Her voice was soft, steady, but every word was chosen with precision. She told the king, "Your Majesty, I am but a woman. I speak not to instruct, but to learn. If I have offered opinions, it was only to benefit from your divine wisdom." There was silence. Then, slowly, Henry turned to look at her. For a long moment, no one knew what he would do. And then he smiled. "You are become a perfect woman," he said. In that moment, the danger passed. The warrant was never served. Catherine had diffused a king's suspicion, not with power, but with grace, restraint, and a masterful understanding of his pride. She had not simply survived, she had outwitted death itself. When the Lord Chancellor arrived the next day with guards to arrest the Queen, Henry dismissed him with cold fury. The warrant was torn in pieces. The danger, for now, had passed. Catherine Parr was not silenced. In the final years of Henry's life, she became the first Queen of England to publish a book, not once, but 3 times. Her most powerful work, Lamentation of a Sinner, was a bold declaration of faith and a personal confession of belief in grace, mercy, and scripture over ritual. She was no longer just the queen who survived. She was a voice in England's great religious transformation, a woman who dared to think, to write, and to speak her truth. On the 28th of January, 1547, Henry VIII died. After nearly 4 years of marriage, Catherine Parr was now a widow once more, this time the Dowager Queen of England. She had survived a king feared across Europe, a man who had executed 2 wives, exiled another, and turned the throne into a crucible of ambition and blood. Now, for the first time in her adult life, Catherine was free. That freedom brought with it a familiar name, Thomas Seymour. Ambitious, charismatic, and still a member of the royal inner circle, Seymour had once courted Catherine before she became queen. Now he returned, not as a suitor in waiting, but as a man emboldened by opportunity. Just months after the king's death, Catherine and Seymour began a secret correspondence. Their affection, long restrained, now rushed forward with the force of years denied. In the spring of 1547, Catherine Parr married Thomas Seymour in secret, without the approval of the Regency Council that now ruled in the name of the young King Edward VI. The secrecy was not just improper, it was scandalous. As Dowager Queen, Catherine was expected to remain a dignified symbol of Henry's legacy, not to remarry hastily, and certainly not without the Crown's permission. When the union was made public, the backlash was immediate. The court was divided. The Seymour brothers, Thomas and Edward, grew tense with rivalry. And worse, whispers of impropriety reached the ears of young Princess Elizabeth, who had been living under Catherine's care. Catherine had taken the young Elizabeth Tudor, now 13, into her household. She treated her like a daughter, but Thomas Seymour's behavior became increasingly troubling. He was overly familiar with the princess. He entered her chambers uninvited. He tickled her, embraced her, all under the guise of playfulness. Catherine at first dismissed the incidents as harmless, but as they grew in frequency and discomfort, even she could no longer ignore the threat. Eventually, she sent Elizabeth away, not out of anger, but to protect her from a situation spiraling beyond control. For the first time, the queen who had soothed a tyrant and outwitted a council found herself betrayed from within her own home. In the summer of 1548, Catherine Parr, at the age of 36, became pregnant for the first time. It was a miracle she had never expected, a final chance at family, a child born of love, not duty. On the 30th of August, she gave birth to a daughter named Mary at Sudeley Castle. But the joy was short-lived. Within days, Catherine fell gravely ill. She had contracted childbed fever, the same fate that had claimed countless Tudor women before her. On the 5th of September, 1548, Catherine Parr died, only 6 days after giving birth. She was buried at Sudeley Castle, the only English queen to be laid to rest on private grounds. She died quietly, away from the court that had once tried to destroy her. But her final words, spoken through fever and exhaustion, endure. I am not afraid to die. Catherine Parr died quietly, without a state funeral, without royal pageantry, and without a great monument. She had never been the king's great passion, nor the crown's brightest ornament, but what she gave to England was something far greater: stability, compassion, and reform. Catherine Parr was the first woman in England to publish books under her own name in English. In a time when women were expected to be silent, she became a voice for thought, for faith, and for conscience. Her writings were deeply personal, yet politically dangerous. They challenged the established church, emphasized personal access to Scripture, and called for spiritual awakening, ideas that would echo into the English Reformation. But perhaps Catherine's most enduring legacy lived on in a child who was not her own. Princess Elizabeth, brilliant, cautious, and underestimated, had spent her formative years under Catherine's guidance. From her, Elizabeth learned the power of patience, of moderation, of intellect over impulse. When Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1558, she would rule with a sharp mind, a steady hand, and a gift for survival, all traits that had once defined her stepmother. The England Catherine Parr helped shape was one moving toward literacy, reform, and reason. She supported scholars, she guarded the future king's education, and she advanced the belief that even a woman, especially a woman, could hold religious and intellectual authority. Unlike queens who ruled by blood or ambition, Catherine ruled with thought. She did not challenge the throne, but elevated it. History remembers her as the queen who survived. But she was more than a survivor. She was a reformer in secret, a mother in spirit, a scholar in a crown, and in the age of absolute power, she proved that courage can be quiet and still unshakable. In a dynasty defined by fire and fury, she endured. Thank you for joining us as we uncovered the remarkable life and quiet strength of Catherine Parr, the queen who survived. If her story moved you, inspired you, or made you see Tudor history in a new light, please like this video, subscribe for more compelling stories from the past, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear which part of Catherine's journey, from scholar to queen to survivor, stayed with you most.